So drug use to me is volitional behavior. I decide whether I will or I won't do it, and I decide when and how I will do it. And I could be anything from experimenters because a pal of mine said, why don't you try this, through to it's something I do every weekend as part of what I do on the weekend. But the point of it is, I decide.
Yeah.
What changes with drug dependence is the drug decides. And so I have lost control. I can no longer turn that behavior on and off. And because of that, I will do things, even though I know they're not in my interest, but I will do them because I don't have the ability to not do it. And I think what happens is that this determination, that clear differentiation between I decide and I'm no longer able to decide.
Boom. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Real Drug Talk. My name's Jack Nagel, and today I'm excited because we have how do we say, not a colleague, like a professional associate, I guess we call it, of mine, Robert Adelaide, who has one of the biggest brains of a human that I know. And sometimes when I talk to him, my head kind of spins. No, I'm just taking the piss a little bit, but I am excited to have Robert on the show because Robert is an addiction medicine specialist, public health physician, and is a senior, I better not mess this up, is a senior research fellow of the University of Adelaide and an associate professor as well. Is associate professor in addiction medicine or in addiction studies. Is that what it is?
Yeah, no, the associate professor title is at the University of Adelaide because of my seniority.
There you go. Okay. So that just proves to everyone who is academic my lack of academic knowledge there. But I was really keen to have Robert on the show because I've had some interesting conversations with him over the time, over sandwiches and stuff, about, you know, addiction and sort of the medical aspects of it. And also, I think, you know, the thing about Robert is how long you've been doing this whole caper for?
About 35 years.
Yeah, 35 years. So, and in that time, from all the stuff that I see still to this day on social media and what I know, you know, Robert does this stuff internationally, is very prominent in the area of advising governments and, you know, being at the cutting edge of, you know, different research initiatives and all that sort of stuff to kind of further the evidence around addiction and how it impacts the population in all the different areas. So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. And I've got some doozies of questions to ask him because one of the things which I always explain is that what we want to do with this show is yes, we do personal stories. Yes, we do kind of family stories and interesting people in the space, but we really want to talk to professionals that are at a high level and delivering services on the ground and all the different aspects. Because I feel like when it comes to media and the 3-minute grabs that people get to explain incredibly like complex topics just isn't sufficient. And unfortunately, there's no platform for the leaders in our space to really have these conversations. So that's kind of the purpose behind it. And I think it'll be really interesting today to kind of chat to you about, you know, is addiction a disease? You know, how does the World Health Organization classify it and how does that all run? Because this is something that I talk to about, particularly when we have personal stories on the show, and the listeners will know, is, you know, people are always got the question, is it a disease? Or I didn't relate to that, or I really did relate to that. It really helped me. It causes quite a bit of controversy, and naturally people want to know. So I'm excited to have all those conversations, but I'm going to shut up now. How are you?
Well, I'm good, Jack.
That's good. That's good. How's Adelaide on, what are we, Friday today? Is it cold as anything?
Well, it's fined up and it's looking like it's going to be a fine weekend, but it's definitely autumn is around.
How good's that? How good's that? Well, it's a shitty day here in Melbourne, so that doesn't make me feel any better.
Sounds very unusual for Melbourne weather.
So just off the top, like just before we dive into some of that stuff that I said I wanted to talk to you about, how did you get involved in this space 35 years ago or throughout your career? Like what's the interest and where does it come from? And yeah, how did you get involved?
Okay, well, in South Australia, there'd been a Royal Commission, the Sackville Royal Commission, which had looked into drug use and drug harm. And one of the recommendations of that Royal Commission was to move drugs out of psychiatry and place them in public health. And as a consequence of that, the psychiatrists that were working in the specialist treatment services left. They decided that they would focus their energies elsewhere. And I got asked if I would come in on a temporary basis to help manage the transition until they found somebody to replace the people that had moved on. And that temporary time happened to be at the time that Bob Hawke had declared on national television that his daughter had a heroin addiction.
Wow.
And he had a summit where he drew the premiers from the states and territories together and decided that they were going to do something. Neil Blewett was the health minister, and he changed Bob's mind from being a focus on heroin to a focus on all drugs, legal and illegal. And I got involved in a series of meetings as a newbie that didn't know many people and felt a kind of a stranger to the area. But what I found was a warm and welcoming bunch of colleagues nationally who were very willing and eager to share their knowledge. And together we just kind of grew, and I decided it was great and never left.
That's really interesting because so you would say at that time that the space and the field of alcohol and drugs, whether it's research, service delivery, policy, it sounded like, even though that, you know, with Bob Hawke, horrible circumstances and all the different things that were happening, but it sounds like it was an exciting time in the space.
Well, it was, because it was, I think, genuinely a recognition that there was a significant problem and a great uncertainty about what to do about the problem. But people collectively put differences aside to try and work collaboratively. And there was money available to do something, which was really a significant change.
Interesting. So I'll go out on a limb here. I kind of feel like, I'll preface it by saying that I feel like it's actually changing with some of the stuff that's going on at the moment and the narratives in the media and stuff. But I would say that that's probably been a problem for the alcohol and drug sector and space in my recent times of just being involved in it, is that it hasn't really been a exciting kind of, well, it is exciting, but I don't know how to explain it. Like, it's not incentivized, or it's because of the stigma around it and the infrastructure and the pay wages and all that stuff. It hasn't been very attractive for people to kind of get involved in it. And I feel like there's been a real lack of innovation and change and stuff. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, it's curious, isn't it? Because I think when I first came into the area, there was a sense in the general medical community that nothing worked. And so treatment and support was devolved down to non-professional people who hadn't had any formal training, clinical training. And that was a weird collection of different views about how to approach things. And over time, the field has become more professionalized, and the people who work in it now have got a theoretical structure for clinical care and support. But having said that, the stigma issue that you've raised is real. That has not gone away. When I first said that I was going to stay working in the area, I can't tell you how many times I had friends and colleagues question my sanity,
Wow.
wondering why in the hell I was going to go into a dead-end job that would have no career opportunity, and work with a bunch of people where whatever you did didn't work.
That's funny. Yeah,
It is
interesting.
funny, and so that was quite challenging and confronting. And I'm sure that if the more people you speak to about this, you'll hear that as a recurring theme. That when I went and started working with colleagues in the United States, I was struck by the fact that a significant proportion of the workforce there were people who were in recovery, but they didn't actually have any formal training. The skills they brought was their life experience, and that was a much more prominent role than it was here. And we still had that divergence of opinion. You were either a clinician or you were somebody who was in recovery, but the two weren't necessarily the same.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, like I love chatting, to, because he often reminds me, Steve Alsop, who we had on the show a couple of months back, and other people like yourself that have been involved in the space a long time, is, because you can get a bit disheartened and think, oh, it's all fucked. Nothing's changing. But actually, when you zoom out and look at it in a snapshot, like a lot has changed and there's been a lot of good progress.
Yes. But as with all things in change, it's like the economy. You have good times and bad times, So you think things are going gangbusters and then suddenly it all goes pear-shaped and you have to rebuild and start again. I think part of the benefit of having people who've been around for a while is that knowledge about, well, what's worked in the past, so you don't feel as if you've got nowhere. But overall, I think there's been improvement, but there have been setbacks.
So just on that, like I'm interested. Out of all the things that you have done in the space, like, has there been anything that's grabbed you, like particularly that you're sort of really keen on in focus there? Because I know, say you're an addiction medicine specialist, so obviously you care about addiction, but you're very across just the alcohol and drug space as a whole, and the different policies that revolve around that, and, all that sort of stuff. Is there any one area that really grabs you that you're interested in?
Look, I think translation of evidence into practice has been my passion for the last decade. There's a lot of people that spend and waste a lot of time doing things that we know don't work and are potentially more expensive than things that do work. So trying to encourage people to move towards things that work and to get what we call fidelity of practice, that they don't just say they do it, they actually do it. That's probably been my most recent driver. But when I first started, there was so many different things to do that you ended up doing everything. And so you didn't specialize in a particular area. I remember I went to a meeting in Sydney that was in the mid to late 1980s, where there was a concern that cocaine was about to flood Australia. Crack cocaine had been a problem in the US and the government was desperately concerned. And
would you kind of equate it to like almost how fentanyl is at the moment?
Yeah. So the canary in the coal mine was screaming things could get really bad, and they called a meeting. Now, as that turned out, that meeting was pivotal for me. I met Alex Wodak. I sat at the table with him for the evening meal. We had a long conversation about a variety of things, but I took away from it 3 key messages that had never occurred to me. One was that we were doing methadone wrong. The second was how come they were doing harm reduction programs and we weren't. And the third was how can we get better connected to the community's voice, to the people who use drugs, to understand what's going on. So I went back to Adelaide, and the CEO of our organisation was Graham Strathern, and I suggested to him that we should be doing this new thing called needle exchange, and that there was a real risk about HIV, and that we needed to be thinking about preventing it as a way of doing it. So we went to see the health minister of the day, John Cornwall, who was a vet by training. And John sat in his office and listened to the spiel, and turned to the Chief Health Officer for the South Australian Department of Health, Bill McCoy, and said to Bill, "What do you think, Bill?" And Bill said, "I don't know, Minister, it sounds a bit courageous. I think we should wait and see what happens." And John said to Bill, "Well, I don't agree, Bill. I think they've got a point. Find the money." So we started needle exchange on the basis of a conversation that occurred with Alex Wodak over dinner in Sydney.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's, so, and that was the pathway of engagement to collaboration with people who use drugs, because no longer were we just seeing people who came in for treatment. We were seeing people who use drugs, but were trying to reduce their risk. And that expansion in concept of engagement with the community is a significant and enduring component of Australia's approach.
It's really interesting. I think people are really interested in how policy has changed and shifted, and like how you explain there with the uptick of the needle and syringe programs. Is that kind of how it happens? Like there's a bunch of people doing things and having conversations, trying to create change, and then you land a meeting with someone in government, and you put the idea across well enough and connect, and it kind of goes from there? Or is there something more in depth that happens?
Well, I think many examples have been by university researchers who've looked at the international evidence. They pulled the evidence and looked at the application of what that might mean, and then float the idea. And they can either do that through the National Health and Medical Research Council funding, or they might encourage government to move it forward. I mean, if you look at the naloxone program, we were doing overdose risk reduction work in the early 2000s. Simon Linton and others have maintained the energy, and now naloxone as a viable way of reducing risk of overdose death. Finally, the chorus of voices have been heard, but it took time. It wasn't to get commitment, because all of these things are seen as risky. It's very easy in hindsight to say we dodged the bullet on HIV in Australia, and we did because of the scale up of methadone treatment programs and the introduction of needle exchange, and telling people about how to avoid risk. So we're incredibly lucky. But on the overdose side, we've had so many different thoughts about how you might prevent it, providing information to reduce risk, providing means to reduce risk. But then when there were innovative programs suggested, like Gabriel Bammer suggested a trial of injectable heroin, and there was a lot of enthusiasm about that. The Ministerial Council on Drug Strategy endorsed it. But John Howard was sick at home in bed with the flu, and was listening to talkback radio, and there was a chorus of anger, and he overrode it. He stopped it.
Yeah, and then it's never to kind of be seen again.
Yeah, but in the aftermath of that, the massive increase in funding for drug treatment programs was a way of then overcoming it. Well, we're not going to do that, but we will do this. So, yeah, it's in terms of where the innovations come and how they are. I think some of it is driven by consumer voice, some of it is driven by research interest, and some of it is by government saying, well, they're doing that in another country. Why aren't we doing it as well?
Interesting. And I think it's good for people out there to hear, because we've had some feedback from people, they want to hear from more people like you that have been in these different positions to kind of get some ideas about, how to contribute and put their ideas forward and be a part of the change, which is really interesting. So just on that kind of topic of overdose, harm reduction, that side of things, like if Mr. Frydenberg and some of I don't know who the state treasurer is in Adelaide, but some of the state treasurers were to open their safes and give you a day's worth of financial and public health policy decisions in the alcohol and drug space in the area of harm reduction, like what would you do? Like, would you be in favor of something like a heroin trial where we're giving people not free heroin, I don't mean to say it like that, but like legal heroin that already have habits? Would it be like, where would you go with it?
Yeah, so I was part of the WHO group that independently evaluated the Swiss heroin trials. And we were given free access to their data. We went and had a look at their clinics, and we were... The Swiss government were very concerned that the international community would deride the quality of their scientific work.
Wow.
So they were very, very open and transparent with access. And the things that I took away from that, which I thought were really, really quite important messages, was that supervised injection of heroin is a treatment of last resort.
Right.
And that was seen both through the eyes of the people who were in treatment as well as those who were providing the treatment and care. Because you run out of options. You'd hit the end of the road. And the second thing that was obvious to me was providing it was actually an axis for engagement. So they didn't just provide the heroin. The Swiss were remarkably good at providing social care and support, reconnecting with community, helping people to get a sense of self-worth and self-identity. And so several people who were in that program actually exited out of injectable heroin and went back into other forms of treatment, and then eventually went back into a re-engagement into civil society.
So when you say on that first point, the first thing to take out of that trial that they had there, or the program, do they still run that program where they do? And
they're not the only country that does. But you see, the thing is, it's expensive, and one of the things that I think frustrates many people who listen to me is resource allocation is important. You've got to think about where's the return on investment of how you spend your money. So your question started with, if I could get the treasurer to open his piggy bank, how would I invest the money? Well, I think I would be looking at also adequately resourcing those things that we currently do, that we know that work, that aren't adequately resourced.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then, truthfully, we have people who are desperate, and we have people for whom the current things don't work, and we should be exploring new and innovative approaches. But I'm not a big advocate for going off and spending proportionally, substantially more money on something, and then giving it to people that wouldn't be seen in an appropriate way.
That's really interesting. So there's a couple of things out of that I want to talk to you about. But so just going back to the Swiss heroin trial, when you say giving injectable heroin to people as a last resort, so you're saying after they've tried to do some inverted commas traditional treatment types and they've tried different services and whatever, and then if that doesn't seem to be working, then moving them onto that trial would be the best, or was the best.
Yeah. So a couple of points I want to make on that, because it can be easily misunderstood. when I first started in this area, you had to fail detox and therapeutic community before you could be considered for opiate agonist treatment like methadone. And that's dumb. That makes no sense at all. But that was you had to jump through the hoops, and we used to go through this exercise, and that's part of that discussion that I had with Alex, was that I transformed my belief that there was something special and magical about methadone. You could actually do it in primary healthcare. You didn't need a specialist clinic, but for some people you did need a specialist clinic because they were complicated, and you needed people who really knew their stuff to manage that. Having said that, methadone's cheap. Heroin's cheap, but the infrastructure that you wrap around it to provide it is expensive. And that's where you've got to think about that hierarchy that in medical training, what we tend to think of is we have first line interventions. And if those first lines don't work, then you've got a second line and then a third line. And the risks and the benefits tend to go up and the costs tend to go up.
Right. Interesting. So why, like, the other question I wanted to ask you about that, just off the back of what you just said as well, is why is it so expensive to do the, essentially put people on a regime of giving them heroin? Why is that cost so much?
Well, I think part of it for the Swiss experience was the fact that they had supervised dosing. So you need to have a clinic, you need to have staff who are trained. If you think about the medically supervised injecting rooms that happen in Australia, they're also potentially quite expensive. But their cost is justified in terms of the return on investment for lives saved. So you don't. But that supervised injecting rooms really only are necessary when you've got a lot of injecting in public spaces.
Got it. That makes sense. So the way that I try and simplify it to explain it to people is kind of like, even though the pointier end, because I think people get confused sometimes, or maybe that's how I used to think about it, but I'll just give this quick explanation so people listening can understand. Even though like treatment centers, or if you think about like a traditional rehab, that would still be kind of incorporated in a public health model, of course. But for people to kind of think about it, because I think when we talk about public health, people automatically just think about rehabs. But one of the main functions that I think about when we're talking about public health, and particularly like policy decisions, is all the, for a lack of a better term, upstream things that you can do before people get to rehab that, as Robert's talking about, might reduce their risk and, help them not to have to engage in that rehab service. Because from what I understand, or I personally think, it's kind of expensive as well to put someone through, a fully traditional rehab setting where they stay for 3 to 12 months, whatever it might be. So when you said to adequately fund the services that we have, like what type of services are you talking about that that you feel could be changed, or not changed, adequately funded?
Well, I think there is a significant inadequate resourcing of treatment for early treatment and care for youth.
Yeah.
If you are a
Which makes
young
sense.
person and you have a serious problem,
Mm.
there's very little choice around. And the choices that are around are either expensive or they don't actually manage that. They manage that and other things, so they're not expert in it. So that idea of getting in early is an area that's a big gap. I also think that the capacity to provide access to community-based treatment is really limited. And that's worse the further you get away from a capital city.
Yeah.
So if you're in rural or remote Australia, your options are either nothing or people you know or maybe are related to you. So that's, it creates a conflict.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a problem. And I guess the other area is that there is a significant overlap between mental health disorders and substance use disorders. It's not a complete overlap, but there is a significant overlap. And unfortunately, both areas could do with the scaling up and expertise for managing those people who have serious mental health problems and serious drug and alcohol problems. That group are poorly managed. So those would be my priorities.
Interesting. I actually really agree, particularly with the last one. So can you explain that to people that are listening? What are the issues now if someone has a co-occurring mental illness and substance use issue? What sort of happens when someone tries to engage in the service system?
Well, commonly what happens is that whichever service you go to says the other service has got to fix their problem before they'll fix your problem. Right. What they're basically saying is you've gone through the wrong door, and I don't care which door you've gone through, it's the wrong door.
Yeah.
And that's getting better. I think drug and alcohol area now feel more confident about managing less intense mental health disorders, so anxiety, etc. And the mental health areas who are typically the expert mental health areas are dealing with bipolar disease or schizophrenia that have got serious mental health issues. Right. Well, substance use disorders are overrepresented in that. They're often taking the drugs to help moderate the side effects of the medications they're being prescribed for their mental health disorder. And at the moment, it's as if it doesn't happen. So often there won't be a conversation about it. And if there is a conversation about it, then people don't really know how to assess severity of risk from the drug's point of view and what to do about it. So that it's a knowledge gap.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of, it gets a little bit complicated too, because it's something that I'm seeing a lot as well, because we're just at the moment finding myself working with people that have very acute mental health issues and you would say acute addiction or substance use issues as well. And just, just that whole acute system, it's so hard, like it's so overrun for the people trying to deliver those services and then trying to decide what to do with people and the reasons why. And yeah, that's something that we see a lot, is that often if they go in for, psychotic issues into a psychiatric unit, often once those psychotic symptoms disappear, they're released, but there's a lack of understanding that most of the people using drugs with those mental health issues, it's because of their negative symptoms and they feel incredibly depressed. So they just go back out and use drugs and it causes the psychotic symptoms and they just go in and out of hospital 25 times, right. So yeah, it is an interesting point. Like how hard is it to, and I haven't even got to what I really wanted to talk to you about, but from someone that kind of sees this at all levels as, yeah, someone that, because you've done it in all levels, really. You've done that policy side of things that we've been talking a lot about, but yeah, you've operated a substantial clinic, if I remember correctly, in Adelaide, and been the head of that as well. So you've seen it at all different levels. Like, how hard is it to upskill a workforce to get to that point where there is that knowledge gap taken care of? Like, do we need to upskill the workforce to be able to deal with both, or just educate people in the areas of the other area? Like, how, yeah.
Yeah. So the models that have been used have been, firstly, to develop resources that could help each workforce know each other's space, and the Commonwealth Government commissioned those resources to be developed. I actually think it needs to go a step further. I think what we need is in-reach placement of the expertise in the other camp. So when I was clinical director at DASA, one of the things that I did was that I employed a senior psychiatrist to come and work in our organisation.
Wow.
And to be able to collaborate with our staff to help mentor and guide and help them feel confident that they were managing the mental health disorders at best practice level. And I know now DASA is now doing clinical inreach into mental health services, where they're sending experts in to help manage the other side, the addiction side. So they'll go and provide co-therapy. I think that bridging is actually incredibly important, because if I can give you a manual to read, well, yes, you can read it, and yes, you can understand it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to do it in a way that is going to be correct and uniform. And often what happens with people is that you hit a pothole in the road and you just go back to your old behavior because, well, it didn't work. Whereas if you've got a mentor there to guide you through, problem solve, you can maintain your energy and your momentum to keep going on it.
100%. No, it actually makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah, because you're not having to start again. It's kind of filling a gap. So, again, before I ask you about this whole disease business, one of the other things that I've kind of learnt and become aware of, and I've always been a big supporter of some of the things that you kind of put forward, is that there's just, to me, there seems to be, a real lack of addiction medicine specialists. Do you call them doctors or physicians that are available? That are available for clients to access. There's probably more, but like, I'm thinking in Victoria where I am, I can only really think of maybe 10, I think, off the top of my head that I know of. There's probably more. But yeah, there's just not a lot that are hyper specialists in that area. Why is that? Like, how come that? Yeah. Why is there such a gap?
Well, it took a long time to get agreement that addiction medicine was a defined area of medical expertise. So to become a specialty that's recognised by the Medicare benefits schedule, you need a college to mount a case that says this is a defined area of expertise. So when you've got a problem with your heart, you go and see a cardiologist, and you're pretty confident that that doctor knows a hell of a lot about cardiovascular disease, because that's their area of expertise. So it took a long time to make the case. And initially there was a disagreement about where it should be located. Should it be a subspecialty of internal medicine, which are general physicians, or should it be a subspecialty of psychiatry? And there was a case made by a group of us that actually it belonged in general physicians in internal medicine because there were public health components of it, but there were physical consequences of it. And having that physician training could manage the physical consequences of drug use, harm, and dependence. And of course, there is a mental health component to it. And the College of Psychiatry has got a special interest group where you can get a qualification in addiction, but you can also get co-fellowship in the College of Physicians as an addiction medicine specialist. Right. But to answer your question, why? Well, because when you start a new program, you have to recruit trainees into the program. Right. And if you're a new medical graduate and you're thinking about a career, the first thing you need to do is to recognize that's potentially a career for me. And if you don't have a physical presence of addiction medicine in a hospital, then as an undergraduate medical student, you won't see it. If it's not part of your undergraduate medical curriculum, you won't even think it's part of your core knowledge. So we failed at two levels. We failed at a level of having a physical presence in the hospitals, and we failed at maintaining a commitment to include drug and alcohol as an examinable required component of undergraduate medical education. But then the third level we failed at was that, having created the specialty, the item numbers, the MBS item numbers that were established, you would get paid more being a GP than you would be paid to be an addiction medicine specialist.
Unbelievable.
That is not the strong incentive to take it up as an undergraduate.
That's right. No, that reminds me, I always remember, it's forever in my mind, when I was it always relates, and it's something more broadly, which is probably another conversation. I've had it before on the podcast, is this business about incentive, and in like that I think needs to kind of shift in a lot of areas actually in the alcohol and drug space. But like when I was refereeing basketball when I was a young teenager, and they said, well, why don't you do your A grade, where you had to go and do all this stuff extra and get abused by people on high pressure games and stuff. And I think it was only like $1.50 more per game that you got. And I remember saying to the lady, well, why would I do that? It doesn't make sense. Is that still the case with the addiction medicine specialist stuff?
So there's been a review of the Medicare benefit schedule item fees for a variety of specialties, which included addiction medicine. And that review has put forward a case to change the basis of remuneration. And it's sitting on Greg Hunt's desk.
All right. Well, Mr. Hunt, if you're listening,
Greg, push it on.
That's right. Push it on.
Because, but they need to deal with the other two things.
Yeah.
And when you talk about who does what, trying to wedge anything into the medical curriculum is a nightmare. But I'm fortunate. I work in a university and I teach 2nd, 4th, and 6th-year medical students. You need somebody in the university pushing it as an agenda item. But the other thing we need is that we need the states to stump up the cash to have an addiction workforce in the hospital setting doing consultation liaison work, the same as every other subspecialty in the hospital. Could you imagine a hospital if you broke your leg and there was no orthopedic surgeons there? I mean, just kind of like, well, good luck.
I know, it's unbelievable. It just shows how much the stigma impacts it, which I've been talking a lot about people as well, just in so many levels. and yeah, like it's a medical condition, and it just impacts the workforce and what's available to people. So how long have you got before you have to go? Because I've got a few more questions here.
I've always got time for you, Jack.
All right, very good, very good. So I just want to keep going on this because I think it is very important for people to understand, and it's so interesting. How much, like, so if someone wants to be an addiction medicine specialist, like how much study, like in terms of lifetime, is that? How long does it take someone to get to that level?
So you've got 6 years of undergraduate medicine.
Uh-huh.
Then you're going to do 3 years of basic training. Then you're going to do 3 years of advanced training. So 12 years all up.
12 years. Yeah. So it's actually ridiculous that how long does it take to be a GP? Is it 6 or 7 years?
Yeah. So that's the undergraduate plus their training program as well. Yeah.
It's insane that it's the pay disparity is so much there. So moving on into that addiction space, which I have had some interesting conversations with you about. And just to frame it up for everyone, I think so. I feel like one of the problems that we have for stigma in Australia is addiction isn't seen as a medical problem. And I think one of the failings of the health communications from people in the space is, on one hand, we try and tell the public that this is a medical condition. But in the current way in which we think about medical conditions, we don't really present a strong case of it actually being a medical condition and what the diagnosis might look like, which kind of makes it challenging, I think, for people to stomach or understand, because on one hand we'll say, oh, this is a medical issue, but it's because of social determinants of health that are really impacting it. And we'll talk about that a lot. And then the whole thing gets lost in the mix. And something that I've always raised is that, I think to kind of get things shifting is that it needs to be presented in a medical format for the public to swallow that, like mental health is. And that's, I feel like, a big part of the reason why they've been successful is that they've been able to articulate that, no, this is actually, yes, there is factors, but this is actually something that happens in the brain. It's a chemical imbalance. But in saying that, what we've got, which is the disease model, kind of doesn't fully land with me anyway, and it's heavily disputed. And so I know that's a bit of a mix-max jumble of a question, but would you agree with the first part? And do you think it's a disease from your medical background and all those sorts of things?
Right. So that's such a big question, isn't it? And I guess that where I start is that taking drugs, psychoactive substances, has been within humanity forever. This
100%.
is not a kind of a new thing that's happened. And a large proportion of the population have in their life taken psychoactive substances, both legal and illegal. And it's 40% of the Australian population have at some time in their life tried an illegal substance. 3/4 of us have tried alcohol. So the experience, there's a collective experience of psychoactive substances. I think what happens is that there's a big confusion between drug use and drug dependence.
100%.
So drug use to me is volitional behavior. I decide whether I will or I won't do it, and I decide when and how I will do it. And I could be anything from experimenters because a pal of mine said, why don't you try this, through to it's something I do every weekend as part of what I do on the weekend.
Mm.
But the point of it is, I decide.
Yeah.
What changes with drug dependence is the drug decides.
Mm.
And so I have lost control. I can no longer turn that behavior on and off. And because of that, I will do things, even though I know they're not in my interest, but I will do them because I don't have the ability to not do it. And I think what happens is that this determination, that clear differentiation between I decide and I'm no longer able to decide, is kind of offset by a different point of view, which is who has the right to tell me what I can and I can't do? And so there's this argument which I've had with many people who consume drugs, that it's their right, and if they choose to use that, then they should be allowed to do that. And really, the only reason that there's an impediment on that loss of control is financial affordability. So if you look back in history, there are many clever people. Coleridge comes to mind. Lots of people who've used psychoactive substances to expand their thinking and have been productive people, but it always has a dark edge. And this is where I think I get concerned. And that is because once you have dependence, the risks of harms, physical harms, psychological harms, social harms, legal harms, there are 9 dimensions of risk that you expose yourself to. That risk is real.
Yeah.
And you can't necessarily protect yourself from that risk. So my sense of it is that even for people who aren't dependent, risk is real. And we've already talked about harm reduction approaches to reduce harm. And so I'm big on the idea of reducing risk. But for people who've lost control, I believe that my responsibility is to help them to regain control. And for some, that will mean they can't use drugs ever again. But I've been involved in controlled drinking, so retraining people how to drink and setting rules. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't, but if you can't control it, then it's not pleasant, it's not enjoyable. And in terms of the biology of the brain disease, look, there are different ways that we can think about that. There are brain chemistry changes that occur as a consequence of repeated exposure to drugs. Some of those brain chemistry changes are seen to be plausibly responsible for cueing things like cravings and cueing the need to do it even when you don't want to. And they can also explain why you feel so crook when you stop taking the drug. So the symptoms of withdrawal because of the massive changes that have occurred in brain chemistry. And a lot of those things we can treat, we can manage, but the heart and soul of it is also that existential thing about that desire and the purpose and the need to continue to take the drug. So it's not just about controlling the brain chemistry, it's also about rewiring the way we process risk and understand what we're doing and thinking about other ways of doing that are less risky.
So are you personally of the belief or understanding that it is a brain disease, or is there a different?
I think it's more complicated than it's just a brain disease.
Yeah.
I think there are models that we often use to explain complicated things, and the models can be very helpful into giving us a conceptual understanding of something that sort of works to enable us to make sense of complicated bits. And I think the brain disease, whether you're thinking about that it's through dopamine, a reward system, or whether it's through serotonin or one of the other neurotransmitters, or whether it's the hypothalamic pituitary axis and the cortisol influence, those things all have influence on either I'm rewarded by what I do, I enjoy what I do, or I'm punished for not doing it, and we call that withdrawal. So yes, that's all true. But outside of the brain, the consequences of drugs use are real. And you see, what we haven't really also talked about is the fact that we know that it's not just about brain chemistry. We know that there are impacts upon your gene pool. So there's the risk of inheriting risk, not certainty of dependence, but risk of dependence. We know the environment in which we live either turns on genes or turns them off. So if we live in a family where we've got both parents are condoning or permissive of drug use, who understand and accept you using drugs, who don't mind the fact that you don't get engaged in school, where you continue to engage with a peer group who all use drugs, all of those things can also have an effect on expression of your genetic code, and that can be an intergenerational transfer. So is it a brain disease? No, I think it's environmental. I think you pointed that out earlier on those structural and social determinants of drug use and harm. It's a consequence of your genetic pool, but it's also which drugs you use.
And do you think that in order to get shifts in public perception, or I don't know if this is the right word, like sentiment towards drug users, or the stigma that is around alcohol and drugs, do you think that at least if we can try and separate the difference between drug use and drug dependence, that we need to frame it in a medical aspect to try and change people's minds, similar to how they have in mental health?
It definitely changes the community's acceptance and the political acceptance of what needs to occur. Because if you're saying this is a treatable medical condition, then you see, I haven't used the word disease. It's a treatable medical condition, and I can treat it. It's like high blood pressure isn't a disease, it's a symptom.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that does change is the belief that, oh, okay, so you can do something about it, and there's a knowledge base around what can be done. The challenge that I have is where I started in this conversation, which is there is a consumer voice which is antagonistic to that idea, because they see it very much as their right to be able to choose what they do with their body.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? And do you think there's anything wrong, like just moving it 180 degrees towards calling it a mental health condition and putting it as part of that gamut of diagnosis?
That's where you'll get pushback from me on that, because not everybody who uses drugs has a mental health condition. Not everybody who is addicted has a mental health condition, and vice versa. So there is coexistence. We see sadness coexist commonly with dependence, and a variety of other mental health conditions. I think we're better at recognizing some of the precursors that lead to substance use disorders that we previously didn't. post-traumatic stress disorder being a good example. I think that wasn't thought of clearly 20 years ago, whereas it is thought of very clearly now. But I think my view has always been that it is a treatable medical condition. Dependence is, but drug use is volitional behaviour. The problem is the slope from drug use to dependent use is a slope that you don't know when you're sliding down it.
That's right. I call it the invisible red line that you may or may not cross.
Yeah.
And once you've crossed it, you don't see it until you're usually a little bit too far down the track.
and of course, everybody always carries with them a belief that I will stop before it becomes a problem.
That's right.
And some do. Right? Some do, but some don't. And it's a lottery.
That's right. And yeah, I really think that just around probably the best way for the conversation to go in my perspective, which I don't think we're there yet, is it just has to become a little bit more like a physical health conversation. Whereas, like, you know, it's a cold day here in Melbourne, it's advised to go outside with a jumper on or else you're going to catch a cold. You know what I mean? Same thing with this. Like if you've had a fight with your significant other or there's some high stress at work, and maybe it's advised not to have a drink that night because potentially it could, you know, lead to some addictive patterns forming. So just quickly, like I wanted to ask you as well, like as someone that's so well versed in the space and knows things from a research point of view and a medical point of view and all that sort of stuff, what do you think about a couple of people here, like Gabor Mate's kind of theory of dependence or addiction, where he kind of says that, well, it's all people that are dependent. It's just a trauma response, really, and it's a way of them dealing with some trauma in their life. Do you think there's any validity to that, or that's true? Tough question, I know. Hope you don't know him.
So my view is that people start out using drugs for one of three reasons. They either do it because they like it, or they do it because they're trying to block out emotional or physical pain, or they do it because it actually is purposely improving their performance in something they want to do.
Yeah.
And that journey, that reason for initiation is something that is part of the life course of drug use. And for those who get into dependence, I see that there are either the continuing pursuits of intoxication or the continuing need to prevent withdrawal. And the discourse that you're describing isn't a common thing that I see. It's not uncommon, but it's not the reason.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think I agree with you, and it's become a bit of a meme at the moment, I guess, in mainstream thought of addiction is, and find myself having arguments with people about it all the time, because I find the same thing, that yes, the likelihood of someone having extreme or horrendous events in their life that can cause trauma or PTSD can be common with drug use or dependence, but it's definitely not the reason. And what I'm finding happening now is that, you know, when I'm talking to lots of different people from all different backgrounds, it's actually gotten to a point where there's a lot of people, it's preventing them accessing treatment because they don't want to be categorized in that bucket, and they can't relate to it. You know, it's interesting.
A lot of the PTSD that I've encountered has been relating to heroin users who've witnessed a death from an overdose, and that was way down the track. That was not an antecedent.
That's right.
But having said that, there are people who've had horrendous childhoods. And as I said, there's usually one of three reasons, and blocking out emotional or physical pain is one of the reasons.
That's right. That's right. Now, the other one I wanted to ask you about, who I find incredibly interesting, and he's a bit of a dude as well, is Dr. Carl Hart. Have you seen his work out of, forget where he's from. He's in the States. His latest book is called, off the top of my head, I could butcher it a little bit. It's called Drug Use for Adults and Why Addiction Isn't a Brain Disease. And basically he's kind of become a little bit more famous because he's been on Joe Rogan a couple of times, and he's a researcher and in the areas of drugs, and he never used to use drugs, but after researching them and seeing the effects that they have on people, he recreationally takes heroin and, you know, all this kind of stuff, and he's quite and he's quite open about it, and he's trying to sort of challenge some of the perceptions that society has about drug use and all that sort of stuff. So I won't ask you about him because you haven't heard, but yeah, it'll probably be interesting to get your take on it. Yeah.
Well, let me take a left field on that then. I mean, you know, the psychedelics have had a renaissance in,
that's right.
in acceptability for the treatment of a variety of mental health disorders, and have had unlikely champions who've Peter Boehm says that his depression was cured by the use of psilocybin. So, you know, I guess that the use of psychoactive substances for therapeutic uses is not something to be discounted or ignored.
100%.
It's one of the things that I found incredibly frustrating initially in the political area, was this polarization of view about whether or not cannabinoids could be potentially therapeutically beneficial. And similarly, the opportunity of other psychoactive substances to have potentially medical benefits, we shouldn't discount that or ignore it. I mean, heroin was used as an analgesic right up until the 1950s in Australia.
It's interesting. So also as well, the last question I wanted to ask you, because I do have some conversations with you about this stuff as well, and I think it's something that people don't think of much, and it's off the back of what you were just talking about. Is there any good evidence coming out from the different research that's going into different drugs and, you know, things like ketamine and psychedelics on their impact and effectiveness in treating addiction?
Yeah, for treatment of addiction, I have not seen compelling evidence, but for treatment of mental health disorders, particularly depression and phobias, yes. So there's been mixed experience about treatment for alcohol dependence. I think the studies are a bit premature. We still need some more research, but I've got an open mind on it. I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying at the moment, there's not enough there for me to say, yes, this is something we should be doing.
And are we leading the world, would you say, on some of these issues, or are we a bit behind Australia in terms of what we do?
Yeah, so Australia has always punched above its weight in terms of the quality and breadth of research that it does. The quality of our research community, I think, is really good. There has just been an announcement by the federal government for money to be made available for medical research into the use of these new and emerging psychoactive substances as therapeutic agents. In the US, it's been going on for a long time. I chaired a task force for the Australian government in the 90s, early 2000s, on cannabis, where I got introduced. Interestingly, the Australian Attorney General said, if cannabis is so harmless, why in the hell have we got it illegal? Why don't we just legalise it? That was the question he asked, and you'd be surprised to see nothing's changed.
Yeah.
So, but the Americans at that time were actively engaged in exploring therapeutic uses, but not widely publicised or known. Now that it's branched into psychiatry, it's become a much more mainstream topic. And I think you're going to see a lot of research activity in Australia and in the US over the next 5 to 10 years to clarify the potential roles.
Interesting. Well, appreciate you coming on and putting it out there. I'm sure of some of the feedback we'll do round 2 in not too long, because we'll get some questions in and things like that people want. But no, appreciate it, because I know that the it's sort of, I find this for me, and I would say that I have probably a quarter of the knowledge that you do in all the different spaces. It's very hard to explain intricate and complicated topics that have a lot of different variables and factors impacting them, and distilling it down to like an easy, 3-minute answer. So I appreciate you coming on and giving me the time.
Very much enjoyed the conversation, Jack.
No worries. Thanks. Hey YouTube watcher, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you and your family are doing well in these extraordinary times. I also want to ask you, can you please subscribe and hit the bell notification? We're really launching into our YouTube channel this year and want to build our audience so that we can progress through the ranks and basically get the message of recovery and hope and change and all that good stuff out there to as many people as we can. So we would love it if you would consider it and subscribe and help us out. Also, for anyone seeking help and information and resources, we've put together a 100% free online course that you can access, link in the description. So if you are looking for help, hope that is something that can help you out as well. Until next time, see you in the next video. Peace.